Wyoming Territory, autumn of 1878. The wind carried more than dust that day. It carried a woman's secret. Her name was Eleanor Hart, and she had nowhere left to run. Behind her lay a past she could never confess. Ahead, a stranger's hand offering something that felt like safety or surrender. When she whispered, "I don't know how to be a wife," the rancher, Caleb Boone, didn't smile, didn't tease. He just said, low and steady, "Then just lie down and love me." Not a command, but a promise. Can love be born from fear? Can two broken souls, one haunted by guilt, the other by loneliness, build a life out of silence and trust? And if you were her, would you take that hand, knowing it could save you or ruin you? Out here, under the endless Wyoming sky, love isn't sweet, it's survival. It's the quiet miracle of two hearts choosing to stay, when running would be easier. So, settle in, hit like, share, and subscribe, because this isn't just a story about love. It's about finding home in the last place you expected. Autumn, 1879. The northern wind swept across the wide plains of Gallatin Valley, Montana Territory, whispering through the dry grass and against the wooden walls of a small ranch that stood like a stubborn prayer against the wilderness. Inside that house, a woman sat at the edge of a narrow bed. Her name was Nora Vale. Her hands were clean but trembling, resting on the coarse fabric of her skirt. Outside, the sound of horses, of wind, of an old gate creaking, was all she knew of the world now. 3 days ago, she had become Mrs. Nora Vale Langdon, the wife of Elias Langdon, a rancher who'd buried his first wife 6 winters past and hadn't spoken of her since. The wedding was quiet, no music, no guests, only the preacher, the smell of pine wood, and 2 people who barely knew how to look each other in the eye. Elias stood near the hearth, the firelight turning the silver in his hair into soft copper. His shoulders were broad, steady, the kind of man who worked more than he spoke, who let silence do the heavy lifting. When Nora finally spoke, her voice came out small, as if the words had been hidden too long in her chest. "I don't know how to be a wife," she whispered, the confession trembling in the space between them. Elias turned, slowly, and for the first time she saw the gentleness behind his quiet eyes. He didn't move closer, didn't reach for her. He only said, softly, "Then just lie down and love me." Not a command, not desire, but a way of saying you're safe now. The words broke something in her, not her defenses, but the brittle shell of fear that had caged her heart for years. He crossed the room, his boots barely making a sound on the old pine floor. He reached out, not to take, but to touch her hand rough palm against shaking fingers. His warmth startled her more than the wind outside. The room smelled of cedar and faint tobacco, and in that dim, amber light, Nora realized she wasn't afraid of this man. Not really. She was afraid of being seen, of being known. Elias didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. The lines on her face, the way she flinched at sudden noises, told him she carried something dark. But he also knew that some stories aren't ready to be told, so he gave her space, the rarest gift a man can give. That night, as the wind moaned against the windows, they lay side by side, not touching. His breathing was slow, the kind of breathing that belonged to men who had learned patience from the land itself. Hers was shallow, unsure. "Sleep," he murmured, not turning toward her, the storm's only wind. She listened, and for the first time in months, the sound of another person's voice didn't make her flinch. The next morning, the frost had painted the grass silver. Elias was already outside, splitting wood, his breath white in the air. Nora watched him from the window, her shawl wrapped tight. He looked like part of the land, hard, enduring, necessary. Something inside her stirred. Not affection, not yet, but perhaps trust, the beginning of it. For weeks, she'd lived by one rule: keep moving. Never stay long enough for the past to catch up. But here, with this quiet man and this quiet ranch, the urge to run began to fade, replaced by something heavier and, strangely, more peaceful. She remembered the preacher's words at their wedding: "A house built on silence can still become a home." That afternoon, Elias came in from the barn with hay dust on his sleeves. He nodded at her, the way a man nods at a sunrise, simple, certain. "There's stew on the stove if you're hungry," she said. He smiled just a little. "You made that?" She nodded. "My mother taught me. Before." Her voice trailed off. Elias didn't press. He only said, "Then it'll be good," and sat down without another word. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was building something. Later, as the sun sank over the valley, Nora stepped outside. The horizon was endless gold fading into blue, the kind of sky that makes a person feel both small and infinite. She could hear Elias inside, setting the table, the faint clatter of tin plates, and she thought maybe this is what peace sounds like. Still, when night came, her mind betrayed her memories flashing like broken glass. Screams, smoke, a river gone red. She woke gasping. Elias was already sitting up beside her, his hand steady on her shoulder. "It's all right," he said. "You're here. No questions, no demands, just that." And in that small mercy, Nora felt something shift. The ache didn't vanish, but it softened. She looked at him, his tired eyes, the faint scar on his jaw, and wondered how many ghosts he carried, too. The fire crackled. He leaned back, staring at the flames. "You don't have to be anyone but yourself," he said quietly. "That's enough for me." Tears welled, but she didn't let them fall. Not yet. Outside, the wind rose again, the lonely song of the plains. Nora closed her eyes and listened. This time, the sound didn't scare her. It sounded almost like home. And so began their fragile peace, a marriage not born of love, but of survival, of two souls standing against the same cold. But peace, on the frontier, never lasts forever. And in the silence that followed beneath that endless Montana sky, something darker was already stirring beyond the ridge, a shadow from the life she thought she'd left behind. The days that followed passed quietly, as if the land itself held its breath. In Gallatin Valley, the wind never stopped. It whispered through the tall grass, brushed against the wooden walls, and slipped through every crack of the house like a restless spirit looking for a place to rest. Nora Vale Langdon had stopped counting the days since she'd arrived. The ranch was both a refuge and a kind of exile, a place where nothing demanded she speak. Yet silence asked its own questions. Elias rose before dawn. She'd hear the door creak open, the soft thud of his boots on the porch, and then only the rhythm of an axe splitting wood somewhere out back. It was the sound of his steadiness, his wordless way of saying, "I'm here, you're safe." He didn't ask her to cook, didn't expect her to smile, didn't even look for conversation. He simply was like the mountain beyond the valley, immovable and certain, and somehow that was enough. At first, Nora mistook his silence for distance. She thought of men she'd met before, men whose words were weapons. whose love came like thunder and left ruin behind. Elias was nothing like them. His quiet wasn't cold, it was deep. It was space, a room where she could finally breathe without being seen as fragile. In the evenings, when he returned from the fields, his shirt smelled of hay and smoke. He'd sit near the fire, mending bridles or carving a new handle for a broken tool. Sometimes he'd hum low, tuneless, something that sounded older than either of them. Nora would sit by the window, sewing, pretending not to listen, but she did. She listened to every note, every breath, and in that small cabin, silence became a kind of language, one that neither of them had to learn, because they both already knew it by heart. One night, the wind howled harder than usual. The shutters rattled, the fire snapped and died. Nora pulled her shawl tight and stared into the darkness. She remembered the faces of the people she'd lost her father's eyes. Her sister's laughter, and the memory came like a cold hand closing around her throat. When Elias lit a new lantern, his voice came through the dark, gentle as the glow it cast. "Can't sleep." She shook her head. "The wind sounds like it's calling." He nodded, leaning his back against the wall. "It does that. Makes a person think too much." For a while, they sat without speaking, the light trembling between them. Then she asked, "Do you ever get lonely?" He thought for a moment, then answered, "I suppose I got used to it. Maybe that's worse." She looked at him, really looked this time. His face, lined and weathered by both sun and grief, held no pretense. There was no pity there, no judgment, only recognition. It was strange, she thought, how two strangers could share the same silence and still understand each other better than words ever could. The next morning, she found a small loaf of bread cooling by the window. He'd left a note beside it, barely a few words. "Made too much. Eat while it's warm." It wasn't much, but to Nora, it felt like a doorway quietly opening. Later that day, when he returned from tending the horses, she asked if he wanted coffee. He looked surprised, then nodded. "If it's no trouble." "It's not," she said, and smiled just a little. The coffee was bitter, but it filled the house with warmth. They drank it in silence, steam rising between them like the ghost of a conversation they didn't yet know how to have. As the days shortened, a kind of rhythm grew between them. He worked the land, she tended the small garden behind the house. Sometimes she'd hear him talking softly to the horses, the same steady tone he used with her. Patient, almost tender. Once, when she stumbled carrying a bucket of water, he reached for her arm. The touch was brief, but it steadied her. "Careful," he said. And in that one word "careful," she heard everything he couldn't say. "You matter. I see you." At night, when he'd fall asleep, Nora would sit by the fire and watch the way the light flickered across his face. He looked younger in sleep. The hard edges softened. The weight he carried seemed to lift for a moment. She wondered what kind of loss could shape a man into this quiet, constant, kind, without ever saying it aloud. One evening, unable to hold the question any longer, she asked, "Elias, did you ever love her?" He didn't answer right away. The fire cracked. "Yes," he said finally, "I did, but she died before she knew it." The words hung in the air, heavy but not bitter. Nora felt something ache inside her, not jealousy, but understanding. They were both haunted, both half alive in a world that had taken too much. And maybe that was why they didn't frighten each other. The first snow came early that year. Elias was outside covering the barn roof when Nora stepped into the yard. snowflakes melting on her shawl. "You should come in," she called. "It's freezing." He looked down, smiling faintly. "Can't let the horses freeze." She laughed softly, surprised by her own voice. It had been months since laughter had come without pain. When he climbed down, his gloves were stiff with frost. She reached for them without thinking, laying them near the fire. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For not being afraid of me." Nora looked at him. Then the man who'd given her a roof, a name, and more mercy than she'd known existed in the world, and said, "You never gave me a reason to be." Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, the silence wasn't cold anymore. It was something sacred, the sound of two hearts learning, slowly, how to beat in the same rhythm. That night, before she drifted to sleep, she thought of all the places she'd fled, all the nights she'd prayed for peace, and now, here it was not grand or perfect, but real. A warmth that asked for nothing and gave everything in return. For the first time since her life had shattered, Nora Vale Langdon didn't dream of running, but out there, beyond the valley, something was moving. A rider cutting through the snow, carrying the scent of gunpowder and old revenge. The peace she'd found fragile as glass was about to be tested. But out there, beyond the valley, something was moving, a rider cutting through the snow, carrying the scent of gunpowder and old revenge. The peace she'd found was about to remember her name. Beyond the ridge, the world was frozen white. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low, its light tracing faint gold across the rough-hewn walls. Nora Vale Langdon sat near it, mending the tear in Elias's coat. Her hands worked slowly, her mind elsewhere. Something had changed in the air these last few days. The quiet she'd begun to trust now felt watchful. The dogs barked at night. The horses startled easily. Even the wind seemed to carry a note she hadn't heard before, a sound that belonged not to the land, but to memory. Because sometimes memory finds you before the world does. 3 months earlier, she hadn't been Nora Vale Langdon. She had been Nora Finch, the daughter of Reverend Samuel Finch, a man of small frame and mighty voice who preached justice on the dusty streets of Dodge City, Kansas. Her father's chapel had stood at the edge of town, its white paint peeling, its bell rusted but proud. He spoke against the slave traders who still dealt in flesh behind closed barns and against the railroad men who treated lives like coin. He called them sinners loudly, fearlessly, and for that, he paid. Nora still saw it. Every night when she closed her eyes, the mob, the torches, the sound of boots on wood, and her father's voice not shouting now, just saying her name one last time before the world turned to fire. They'd told her to run. The neighbors, the ones who'd once nodded politely at her in town, turned away. Nobody stopped the men who burned the chapel. Nobody tried. So she ran. She didn't even take a Bible, only a silver locket, tarnished now, with her mother's face inside. She ran until her shoes bled, until Kansas became just a memory of dust and smoke behind her. For weeks she drifted between small towns, working in kitchens and stables under false names: Annie, then Claire, then Vale. The last name she took from the sign of a passing train car marked Gallatin Valley Freight. It was supposed to be temporary, but grief has a way of hardening into identity. And Nora Vale, she became a woman with no past, no family, no faith left to lose. And yet, in some quiet part of her, she still heard her father's voice, clear and stubborn as the prairie wind. Truth doesn't die just because people stop listening. Child. It was that same voice that made her stop running when she met Elias. She had found him by accident or perhaps by providence, a wounded man, dying near the trading post outside Helena. Not Elias, someone else. A stranger named Jonas Pike, who'd been shot and left for dead. She'd stayed with him 2 nights, fed him water, pressed rags to his side until he could speak. When he did, his words were like ghosts come calling. They killed your father for more than words, he rasped. There's a name Marshal Dean Rourke. He runs a trade now, under the law's shadow. Nora's blood ran cold. She knew that name. Rourke had stood outside her father's chapel the night it burned, his badge glinting in the light of the flames. Jonas had smiled weakly. If you ever want to stop running, find Elias Langdon in Montana. He's the only man I trust still breathing. By dawn, Jonas was gone, his heart stopped before the sun rose, and so Nora went north, carrying his message and her father's ghost. She found Elias 2 weeks later, repairing a fence line beneath a sky that never seemed to end. He'd looked at her once, really looked, and simply said, "You've been walking too long. Come inside." That was how it began. Not with love, not even hope. Just the mercy of one quiet man offering her a place to rest. Now, as the fire cracked in the cabin, Nora felt the weight of that mercy like something she didn't know how to deserve. She traced her finger along the stitched edge of the coat, thinking how much life could hide behind stillness. Elias didn't know who she truly was. He didn't know about Dodge City, or the chapel, or the marshal who'd ordered her father's death. She'd wanted to tell him every night she'd almost spoken. But each time, she saw the peace in his face and couldn't bring herself to destroy it. Maybe silence is safer, she thought. Maybe the past will stay buried if I don't call its name. But she was wrong. The past always remembers its own. That night, she dreamed again the chapel burning, her father's voice calling her name through smoke. When she woke, the room was dark and the dogs were barking again. She rose, heart pounding, and peered out the window. At first, she saw nothing but snow. Then a shape, a rider in the distance, unmoving, black against the white. Watching. Nora's breath caught. By morning, he was gone, but his tracks cut straight toward the valley from the main road. Elias noticed the tracks first. "Must be someone passing through," he said. "Snow's deep enough they'll turn back." But Nora knew better. She'd seen that kind of patience before, the kind that waits until you open the door. That evening, she finally reached for the locket she kept hidden beneath her dress. She hadn't opened it in months. Inside, her mother's smile had faded, but her father's voice seemed to whisper again in the silence of the room. "Truth doesn't die, child, but neither does evil." Elias found her by the window, her face pale in the fading light. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded, just thinking. "About what?" She hesitated, then, softly, about how far a person can run before they're found again. He looked at her a long moment, something thoughtful behind his quiet eyes. "Far enough to get tired," he said. "Then it's time to stop." He turned back to the stove, but she knew he'd heard more than she'd said. And that night, while Elias slept beside her, she lay awake, listening to the wind scrape across the walls, the same wind that had followed her from Kansas to Montana. It no longer sounded like freedom. It sounded like footsteps. Outside, in the cold dark, the rider dismounted, brushing snow from his hat. He looked up at the small light glowing through the cabin window and smiled. Marshall Dean Rourke had finally found her, and out there, beyond the veil of snow, fate was circling closer, carrying with it the name of a man she thought long dead, and a secret that would soon test the fragile peace she had built. The night the stranger came. The wind was restless, not wild, but watchful, like something old stirring beneath the snow. Elias had gone to the barn to tend the horses, while Nora sat by the hearth, reading by lamplight. She hadn't touched the book in an hour. Her eyes kept lifting toward the door, toward the dark outside that felt too quiet to be trusted. It was then she heard it faint, irregular, the sound of a horse's hooves dragging, then a fall. Nora stood so fast her chair scraped against the floor. She caught her shawl, threw open the door, and stepped into the cold. The world was silver and breathless, moonlight turning the snow into glass. At the edge of the yard, a figure lay beside a lathered horse. The man was bleeding, his coat soaked black at the side. He looked like he'd ridden through a blizzard and lost. "Elias," she called, her voice breaking in the wind. The rancher appeared within seconds, rifle in hand. His eyes caught the shape in the snow, and, without hesitation, he knelt beside the man. "He's alive," Elias said. "Help me get him inside." They carried the stranger into the house and laid him near the fire. His breathing was ragged, shallow. His face was gray with pain and travel, his left arm bound with a strip of torn cloth. Elias fetched water and whiskey. Nora pressed a clean cloth to the wound, her hands trembling but steady. After a long moment, the man stirred. His eyes fluttered open gray, unfocused, clouded by fever. "Where am I?" he whispered. "Montana Territory," Elias said. "You're safe now." The man gave a short, broken laugh. "Ain't nowhere safe anymore, friend." He turned his head then toward Nora, and for a heartbeat his gaze sharpened. "I know you," he said softly. Nora froze. "You're mistaken." But the man shook his head, a small, weary smile flickering at the corner of his mouth. "Kansas, the chapel. Your father was the only man who didn't take their money." Her breath caught. "Who are you name's Jonas Pike?" he said. "Used to ride with the cavalry, before I saw what they were doing." Elias poured a bit of whiskey on the wound. Jonas hissed through his teeth but didn't flinch. "They're coming," he rasped. "Marshall Dean Rourke. He's not just wearing a badge, he's running the trade. Women, natives, freedmen, anyone he can sell." Nora's voice shook. "He's alive. I thought Jonas cut her off with a pained cough. Alive, and worse. Has a list, names. Yours is on it." Elias set the bottle down hard. "What do you mean?" "Her name." Jonas turned his eyes on the rancher steady. "Despite the fever, he's hunting her. Wants to finish what he started in Dodge City." The words fell heavy, thick as ash. Nora stood motionless, her fingers twisting in the hem of her shawl. For months she had feared the past might find her, but hearing it spoken aloud felt like watching a ghost step through the door. When Jonas tried to sit, Elias pressed a hand gently to his shoulder. "You'll tear that wound open." The soldier shook his head. "Ain't time to rest. I came to find you." Me, Elias frowned. Jonas nodded weakly. "We fought together. Fort Donelson. You saved my life when the river froze over. Figured maybe I could do something back for you before it's too late." He reached into his coat and pulled out a crumpled envelope, stained with blood. There's proof inside. Ledgers, names, routes. Enough to hang Rourke if anyone in Washington still cares to listen. Elias took the envelope and tucked it into the inner pocket of his vest. His eyes, when they met Nora's, were dark and steady. This man's not just dying for nothing. Jonas's lips curved faintly. Didn't come to die. Came to tell her if she wants to stop running, she'll need to stand. Then his hand fell limp. The room went still except for the fire's slow breathing. Nora sat beside him for a long time after that. She closed Jonas Pike's eyes, whispered a prayer she hadn't spoken since Kansas, and laid her hand on his chest until the warmth faded. Elias said nothing. He only stood there, hat in hand, his expression carved from something between grief and resolve. When she finally rose, her face was pale but calm. "He died to warn me," she said softly, "and I can't keep pretending the past won't find me." Elias studied her. Then, let's not wait for it. She looked at him, the quiet man who had given her a name, a roof, a chance to heal, and saw, for the first time, not just kindness, but the iron beneath it. "I can't ask you to fight for me," she whispered. "You're not asking," he said. "I'm telling you, if you stay here as my wife, they'll have to go through me to reach you." The word wife hung in the air like a candle flame, fragile, glowing. Nora felt her throat tighten. "That's not why you married me." He looked at her, and for a long time didn't answer. Then, quietly, maybe not, "But I'm done watching good people get hunted. You want to run again? I'll ride with you. But if you stay under my name." She opened her mouth to protest, but the words never came, because somewhere deep inside, under all the fear, a small part of her longed to believe him, to believe that maybe, this time, she didn't have to run alone. Outside, the snow had stopped falling. The sky was clear, hard with stars. She turned toward the window, her reflection faint in the glass, the ghost of a woman who'd once been Nora Finch, now standing in the house of a man who'd offered her something she thought no longer existed. Safety. Not the kind that hides behind walls, but the kind that's made of trust, of standing beside someone who won't turn away when the storm comes. She looked back at Elias, and for the first time since Kansas, her voice was steady. "If I stay," she said, "we stand together." He nodded once, together, then, later, long after the lamps went out, she lay awake listening to the wind move across the valley. It no longer sounded like footsteps. It sounded like warning. Somewhere out there. Dean Rourke was still coming. But this time, she wasn't alone. When dawn came, the valley was quiet again, but in Nora's heart, something new had taken root. Not fear, not grief, but resolve. The kind a daughter carries when she knows her father's fight isn't over yet. When dawn broke over Gallatin Valley, the snow had stopped falling, but the world still held its breath. Elias Langdon stood by the barn, tightening the saddle straps, his breath a pale cloud in the cold. He didn't speak. Neither did Nora. Some silences are too sacred to fill with words. Jonas Pike had been buried before sunrise, beneath a cottonwood tree near the creek. Elias had dug the grave himself, slow, steady, the way a man does when he's done that kind of work before. Nora had stood beside him the whole time, holding the lantern, her face pale against the dawn. When the last shovelful of dirt fell, Elias placed Jonas's hat on top. He rode far to bring the truth, he said quietly. Nora knelt, brushed the snow from the mound, and whispered, "Thank you." She didn't cry. Not then. The tears had frozen somewhere deeper than she could reach. That afternoon, as Elias repaired the corral fence, Nora stood by the hitching post, staring south toward the line of mountains that marked the road back to Kansas, the road to her father's grave. For months she had avoided that thought. Dodge City was behind her, a place of ashes, death, and names she no longer spoke. But now, knowing that Marshall Rourke still breathed, she couldn't rest until she looked upon the place where her father had fallen. That evening, she told Elias, "I have to go back," she said simply. He didn't look surprised. "I figured you would. I won't ask you to come. I wasn't waiting for you to ask." His voice carried no bravado, no judgment, just fact, the kind that feels like a promise. They left 2 days later, riding east along the frozen trails. The land opened wide before them, endless and white, stitched with rivers that gleamed like steel beneath the winter sun. For long stretches, neither spoke, but in the quiet, something warm began to live between them. Not comfort, not quite love, but something that felt like belonging. At night, they camped beneath the bare cottonwoods. Elias built the fire, Nora boiled coffee, and they sat wrapped in their blankets, watching sparks drift into the black sky. Once, she asked, "Do you believe the dead can still hear us?" He poked at the fire. "If they can't, it sure don't stop us from talking to them." She smiled faintly. "My father used to say the wind carries the prayers that are too heavy for words." Elias nodded. "Then you'll have a strong wind where we're going." It took them nearly a week to reach the edge of Kansas. The land changed as they rode, the air turned drier, the wind harsher. Every mile felt heavier, the weight of memory pressing closer. When they finally reached what was left of Dodge City, Nora almost didn't recognize it. The chapel had been rebuilt smaller now. The bell, new but silent. The street looked cleaner, but the shadows hadn't left. At dusk, she found her father's grave behind the new chapel, marked by a wooden cross leaning slightly to one side. The snow had begun to melt there, revealing the brown, frozen earth beneath. Nora knelt, her fingers brushing the carved name, Reverend Samuel Finch. For a long time, she said nothing. The world around her faded, the sound of wind, the creak of Elias's boots, even her own breath. It was as if time itself had stopped to listen. Then, softly, she began to speak. "Papa, they didn't forget you. The world tried to bury what you stood for, but it's still here in the people you saved, in the man who rode across 3 states to warn me, in this quiet place where the truth still breathes." Her voice trembled. "I was afraid. Papa, I ran, but I'm done running." She looked up at the sky, a pale stretch of silver clouds moving slow above the prairie. "I won't let them win." The wind rose suddenly, rushing through the grass and across the hills, carrying the scent of sage and frost. For a heartbeat, it felt like an answer. Elias stood a few paces behind, hat pressed to his chest. He didn't move or speak, just let her have that moment, the kind of moment a person only gets once in a lifetime. When she finally stood, he asked gently, "You ready?" Nora nodded. "I think so. He deserves peace, and maybe I do too." They spent the night at a small inn outside town. Nora couldn't sleep. She kept hearing Jonas's voice, her father's laughter, the sound of fire cracking against old wood. Sometime near dawn, she rose and stepped outside. The horizon was pink with early light. Elias was already awake, sitting by the horses, rolling a cigarette he didn't light. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. She shook her head. "Too many ghosts." He looked toward the rising sun. Ghosts are just reminders of what still matters." She smiled faintly. "And what still matters to you." Elias Langdon, he turned his gaze to her, steady and kind. "Right now, you?" That was the first time she didn't look away. In his eyes, she saw no pity, only understanding, the kind born from loss and the long miles of silence they'd shared. And in that look, something shifted between them, something quiet and irrevocable. It wasn't love in the way songs described it. It was deeper, the recognition of two broken lives choosing to mend in the same place. When she reached for his hand, he didn't flinch. He only squeezed gently, like a man anchoring a soul back to earth. "Let's go home," she said. He nodded. "Home sounds good." As they rode west again, the sun broke free of the clouds, painting the plains in gold. The wind still carried her father's name, but now it sounded different, not a call to grief, but to courage. Nora looked once over her shoulder at the grave that had both bound and freed her. Then she faced forward. From that moment on, she no longer rode as a woman in hiding. She rode as a woman who had made a promise and intended to keep it. As the snow melted and the trails turned to mud, the land began to breathe again. And somewhere between Montana's thawing rivers and the first green of spring, Nora found what she hadn't known she was searching for, not safety, but belonging. The thaw came slow that year. By the time Nora and Elias rode back into Gallatin Valley, the snows had begun to loosen their hold. Streams broke free from ice, running quick and silver through the pasture land. The land smelled of wet earth and pine bark, of something quietly returning to life. It was April, 1880, the first spring Nora had met without fear in her chest. The ride home had been quiet. Neither spoke much, but there was peace in that. Sometimes, after enough miles, silence becomes its own kind of prayer. When they reached the ranch, the cabin stood just as they'd left it. Smoke still clinging to the chimney stones, the porch half buried in last week's snow. Elias dismounted first and turned to help her down. His hands were rough, warm, steady the same as always. "Home again," he said simply. "Home." It was a word that once frightened her, but this time it felt right, a little worn, a little imperfect, but true. The first few days passed in the rhythm of ordinary things. Elias rose before dawn, the same as ever. He fixed the fence line that had fallen, patched the roof, checked the cattle that had weathered the winter better than expected. Nora kept to the kitchen and the garden, though the soil was still hard and unyielding. She baked bread again, her first in months, and found herself humming without realizing it. Sometimes she'd glance through the window and see him out there, shoulders bent to the work, and something quiet in her heart would loosen. Elias didn't speak much, but she'd come to learn that his silence wasn't empty. It was full of care, of patience, of the kind of understanding that never needed words. He didn't touch her, not beyond what was necessary, but his presence filled every room of the house like steady light. One morning, she woke to find her old riding boots by the hearth. The soles had been split for weeks. She'd meant to mend them, but hadn't. Now they were stitched tight, strong again, the leather patched with a piece of old saddle hide. No note, no mention, just his quiet way of saying, "You belong here." The valley, though, had its own kind of memory and tongues that never tired. Word of Nora's return spread faster than the river thaw. At Jackson Ridge, the small town 5 miles east, people had long memories and longer suspicions. Some called her the preacher's girl. Others whispered the woman who brought death with her. Once, while trading flour and sugar at the general store. She felt the eyes on her. Conversations faltered, then softened to murmurs. A woman at the counter turned her back. Another whispered something behind a gloved hand. Nora said nothing. She only met the shopkeeper's eyes, placed her coins on the counter, and left. When she returned home, Elias was mending a harness outside the barn. He looked up, once saw the stiffness in her shoulders, and said nothing. But that evening, when he went into town for supplies, she noticed he came back with a bruised knuckle and a quiet look. He never told her what happened. She never asked. But the whispers stopped for a while after that. Life at the ranch settled into a kind of gentle repetition. Morning light spilling through the shutters, the smell of coffee and wood smoke, the sound of Elias sharpening his knife at the table. Sometimes she'd sit by the window, stitching or reading, and watch him move through the yard calm, unhurried, always sure of what needed doing. In those small, steady moments, something inside her began to soften the part that had been hardened by fear and loss. She realized she didn't need grand gestures or promises. All she needed was the sound of the axe splitting wood, the rhythm of hooves in the distance, the quiet certainty that she wasn't alone anymore. One evening, while the sky burned pink over the mountains, she brought him a cup of coffee outside. He took it, nodded. "You didn't have to." "I wanted to," she said. He smiled barely, but it reached his eyes. "That's better than have to." They sat together on the porch steps, not touching, not talking, watching the last light fade from the valley. After a while, she said softly, "I used to think peace was something people earned like forgiveness." He looked out toward the horizon. "Maybe it's something people choose instead." She nodded. "Then I'm choosing it." He glanced at her then, his face warmed by the dying light. "Good. Because peace don't come easy out here. You've got to hold on to it, same as breath." That night, she found herself unable to sleep. The air was full of the sound of frogs by the creek, the soft creak of the windmill. She rose, stepped outside. The moon was high, casting the whole valley in silver. She walked barefoot to the edge of the porch, the cool boards grounding her to the moment. Somewhere behind her, the door opened. Elias's voice came quiet. "Can't sleep." She turned. "No, just thinking." "About what?" "About how strange it feels to stop running." He leaned against the doorway, arms folded. "You'll get used to it." She smiled. "Maybe I don't want to." He tilted his head slightly, curious. "If I get used to peace," she said softly, "I might forget what it costs." For a moment, he didn't answer. Then, in that still, midnight voice of his, he said, "Ain't nothing wrong with remembering, but don't let it keep you from living." And in that small, quiet hour, under the same stars that had watched over both their sorrows, Nora realized she wasn't just surviving anymore. She was beginning again. Not as a fugitive, not as a widow of the past, but as a woman with her hands in the soil. Her heart slowly learning the weight of stillness, the beauty of ordinary days. The land around them was harsh, yes, but it was honest, and so was he. And somewhere between the smell of cut wood and the steady hum of crickets, she felt warmth return to a heart that had long forgotten how to trust. As spring deepened and the days grew longer, the silence between them began to change no longer a wall, but a bridge. And though neither said the word aloud, love was already there, quiet as breath, steady as the land beneath their feet. Spring came softly to Gallatin Valley that year, a slow, forgiving kind of spring. The last of the snow melted into the soil, and the pastures turned the color of hope. By May, the creek behind Langdon Ranch ran fast and clear again. Wildflowers grew along its banks, yellow and blue, shy but stubborn. The wind carried their scent through the open windows of the cabin, and, for the first time in years, Nora Vale Langdon found herself breathing without remembering to. She was learning, slowly, how to live inside peace. Elias rose early every morning before the light touched the hills. She would hear him moving around quietly, the clink of a metal buckle, the creak of the floorboards, the soft closing of the door. He never woke her. By the time she stepped outside, the yard would already be alive with the sounds of his work, the low murmur of his voice to the horses, the rhythm of the axe splitting wood, the scrape of leather against stone as he sharpened his knife. He never said much, and she'd stopped waiting for him to, because now she understood some men speak through the work of their hands. When evening came, the light in the valley softened into gold, and Elias would sit by the hearth with his tools spread across the table, reins to mend, buckles to polish, the quiet business of keeping things together. Nora would sew beside him or wash the dishes, humming faintly. Sometimes, the only sound between them was the steady click of his needle through leather, the crackle of firewood, the slow breath of two people who no longer needed to fill the silence with words. It was a strange kind of comfort, the kind that doesn't ask for anything. She used to think love meant declarations, promises whispered in the dark. But Elias showed her something else, that love could be as simple as the steady way he handed her his coat when she forgot hers, or the way he waited for her to speak first when the day had been hard. It wasn't romance the way stories told it. It was presence, and presence, she had learned, was rarer. One morning, she found a fresh loaf of bread cooling on the table. He'd baked it himself while she slept. The crust was uneven, the inside dense, but when she took a bite, she smiled. "You could have woken me," she said when he came in from the barn. He shrugged, eyes crinkling, didn't want to spoil the quiet. "You didn't," she said. "You made it better." He looked at her, then really looked, and the way he smiled made her feel seen in a way words never could. In the long evenings of May, the two of them would sometimes walk down to the creek after supper. The light lingered late, brushing gold across the water. They didn't talk much. Nora would skip small stones across the surface, while Elias leaned against the fence post, watching her with that quiet half-smile. Once, she asked him, "Do you ever get tired of being alone?" He shook his head. "A man who works the land's never alone. The land's got a way of talking back. You just have to listen." She smiled. "And what does it say to you that I'm doing all right?" he said. "Most days." Then, after a pause, he added, "You?" Nora looked out at the creek, her reflection trembling in the current. "It says, I'm still learning how to stay." As the days stretched longer, so did the quiet between them, but it was a living quiet now, filled with things unsaid but deeply felt. Sometimes she'd catch him watching her while she hung laundry on the line, or brushed her hair by lamplight, not with hunger, not with pity, but with a kind of reverence that frightened her in its tenderness. One evening, when a sudden storm rolled down from the mountains, Nora rushed to the barn to help him bring the horses in. The rain came hard, cold, and heavy, soaking her to the skin before she reached the door. Elias was already there, hauling the last saddle from the rail. When he saw her, he frowned. "You shouldn't be out in this. I wanted to help," she said, breathless. He stared at her for a moment, at her soaked hair, her trembling hands, then shook his head and took off his coat, wrapping it around her shoulders. "You've done enough." She wanted to argue, but his eyes were kind, not commanding. The storm outside roared, but in that dim, hay-scented barn, the world seemed smaller, just the two of them. The thunder, and the quiet warmth of his coat around her. For a heartbeat, she thought he might touch her face, but he didn't. He only said softly, "You'll catch cold." She nodded, her throat tight. "So will you." He smiled faintly. "I'll live. Later, after the storm passed." She found him sitting by the fire again, mending one of the broken reins. His hair was still damp, curling slightly at the edges, his shirt clinging to his shoulders. He glanced up as she entered. "You warm now?" "Yes. Good." That was all. But when she walked past him, she saw something resting beside his tools, a small wooden figure, rough and unfinished, shaped like a bird. "You carved this?" she asked. He nodded. "Started it last winter. Never had time to finish. It's beautiful." He shrugged. "It's just a bird." She turned it in her hand, tracing the grain with her finger. "No," she said quietly. "It's more than that." He didn't reply, but that night, when she woke near dawn, she found the bird resting on the table beside her bed, sanded smooth, polished by the faint light of the fire. Days passed, then weeks, and in those weeks, Nora came to understand something her father's sermons had never taught her, that faith wasn't only found in prayer or in words spoken aloud. Sometimes it was found in the small things, the way a man repaired what was broken without complaint, the way he made room for another's silence, the way he stayed. And in that steady staying, love had quietly taken root. It didn't need to be named. It was there in the rhythm of work, the warmth of evening light, the echo of his boots on the floorboards, and the slow, quiet miracle of two hearts that had finally learned how to rest. But peace on the frontier is a fragile thing. It lives in borrowed time. And just as the first wildflowers began to bloom across the valley, the wind shifted again, carrying with it the scent of winter and old memories that would not rest. By November, the valley had turned white again. The rivers slowed, the sky grew heavy, and the days came dressed in silence. At Langdon Ranch, the first snow fell early, soft at first, then thick and endless, blanketing the land until even the fences disappeared. The air smelled of cedar smoke and frost, and every sound felt quieter, softened by the weight of winter. Inside the cabin, the fire was constant. Nora kept it alive through the long afternoons while Elias worked to keep the livestock from freezing. They had spent one full year together, now a year that had turned strangers into companions, and companions into something far more tender, though neither had yet found the courage to name it. And when the snow came, it came with memories. The first storm arrived on a Sunday evening. The wind rose sharp over the ridge, screaming against the windows. Elias came in from the barn, his coat crusted white, his breath ragged, cold enough to make a preacher swear. He muttered, stamping the snow from his boots. Nora laughed softly. "Then we'll count it a blessing you're not one." He smiled that quiet, rare smile that lit his whole face and set another log on the fire. But as the storm gathered outside, something inside her began to stir, something old, familiar, and unwelcome. That night, she dreamed of Kansas again, of her father's chapel burning, of his voice calling her name through the smoke. When she woke, her body was slick with sweat despite the cold. The wind moaned through the cracks in the walls, and for a moment, she couldn't remember where she was, only that she was alone. Then a voice came through the dark. "You're safe. Nora." Elias sat in the chair by the hearth, the glow of the fire painting his face in gold and shadow. He didn't move toward her, just spoke softly, like a man trying not to startle a wild creature. "Go back to sleep," he said. "I've got the fire." But sleep didn't come. Not that night. The next morning, she found him outside, checking the horses. The snow came past his knees, the air sharp as glass. "You'll freeze," she said, her voice muffled in her scarf. He looked over his shoulder, grinning faintly. "Then you'd best learn to ride, so you can find me when I do." She frowned. "Ride in this, in any weather," he said. "A person's gotta know how to get home, no matter what the world throws at 'em." The next day, he brought her a blanket, a saddle, and his old mare, a chestnut named Ruthie. "She's gentle," he told her. "Knows how to take care of the one in the saddle, even when the one in the saddle don't quite know yet." The first few tries didn't go well. Nora's hands were stiff, her movements hesitant. The mare sensed her fear, stepping sideways, snorting in protest. "Don't fight her," Elias said from where he stood, calm as stone. "Trust her to know." "I don't," she whispered. "Then start with trusting yourself." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't push. He just stayed beside her until she tried again, and this time, when Ruthie took a slow step forward, Nora didn't pull away. For the next hour, they moved in wide circles through the snow, her breath visible, her laughter coming easier. Elias watched, arms crossed, a small, her proud smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. By sunset, she was exhausted but lighter somehow, like the air had shifted inside her. That night, while the blizzard thickened, they sat by the fire again. Elias mended a harness. Nora watched the snow swirl past the window. "You ever think it'll stop?" she asked. He looked up. The snow, the running, the nightmares. He set down the leather strap, leaned back in his chair. Maybe not. Maybe they just get quieter, like wolves that learn to keep their distance. She nodded, staring into the flames. "In my dreams, he's always calling my name, my father. I can hear him, but I can't reach him." Elias's brow softened. "What do you do when you hear him?" "I run." "Maybe next time," he said gently. "Don't." That night, the storm grew fierce. The roof groaned under the weight of snow, and the world outside vanished into white. Nora woke again, breath caught, heart pounding. The dream had returned fire, smoke, her father's voice breaking through the roar. She sat up, shaking. Elias was already there. He didn't speak this time. He just reached out and placed his hand lightly against her chest. "Thirsty?" he asked softly. She shook her head. "Then breathe." His palm was warm, his voice steady, in and out. "That's it. Just breathe." And slowly, she did. The tremors faded, her breath found rhythm. For the first time in years, her heartbeat no longer sounded like panic, it sounded like life. When she finally looked up, his eyes were on her calm, unwavering, full of the kind of care that doesn't demand to be thanked. "Better?" he asked. She nodded. "Yes." He started to pull away, but she caught his hand. "Stay," she whispered. He did. Neither spoke. They sat there in the half-dark, the firelight painting their shadows on the wall until the storm began to quiet. Outside, the wind howled its last and then fell silent. In the morning, sunlight spilled across the snow like grace. The air was still, the world reborn. Nora stepped outside and saw Ruthie standing by the fence, her breath rising in the soft clouds. Beyond her, the valley lay untouched, endless and white. Elias joined her, a blanket draped over his shoulders. "Looks like it's over," he said. "Almost," she replied, turning to him, "but not yet." He smiled faintly. "Storms never really end. They just move on." She nodded, her breath misting in the cold air. "Then I guess we'll just keep standing through them." He glanced at her, pride flickering behind his quiet eyes. "Reckon that's the only way." And together, they stood in the hush of morning, the snow glittering at their feet, the worst of the storm behind them. For the first time, Nora Vale Langdon felt that maybe the blizzard hadn't come to break her, but to teach her how to breathe again. By spring, the valley would thaw again, and the world would remember color. But for Nora, it was that winter night with his hand steady on her heart that marked the moment she truly came back to life. When the snow began to melt, it did so slowly, as if the land itself was reluctant to let go of its stillness. The rivers ran wider, the air softened, and the days grew long enough for Nora to forget, if only for a while, what winter had asked of her heart. At Langdon Ranch, spring meant movement again, fixing fences, restocking supplies, and returning to Jackson Ridge, the small town that seemed to hold both memory and rumor in equal measure. Nora hadn't been there in months. She'd told herself she didn't need to go, that Elias could trade and sell without her. But deep down, she knew the truth. It wasn't the town she feared. It was the eyes. And yet, when Elias said that morning, "We're low on nails and coffee," she only nodded and fetched her coat. The air was crisp, clean, the kind that smelled faintly of thawing soil and horses. Elias hitched the wagon, his movements slow and certain. As always, he helped her climb up first, his hand warm and sure beneath hers. "Ready?" he asked. Nora looked at the long road stretching before them, sun melting the frost off the pines. "I think so." He smiled. "That's good enough." Jackson Ridge hadn't changed. The main street still curved around the blacksmith's forge and the small row of wooden shops, post office, mercantile, and saloon. The same sagging church steeple watched over them, weathered but unbroken. But the moment Nora stepped off the wagon, she felt the old hush again, the pause that comes when eyes remember too much. A few women glanced her way, murmured softly. A man tipped his hat but didn't smile. Nora straightened her shoulders. She had learned enough from Elias to know that sometimes the only answer to judgment was quiet dignity. Elias walked beside her, a steady weight at her side. He said nothing, but his hand brushed lightly against hers, not to take it, but to remind her he was there. They stopped by the forge first. The air shimmered with heat, the sound of iron striking iron echoing across the street. The blacksmith, a broad man with soot on his jaw, grinned when he saw Elias. "Langdon," he said, "didn't think the winter'd let you live long enough to need new shoes for your horses." Elias chuckled. "You know me, too stubborn to freeze." They spoke easily, men who'd seen each other through storms and seasons. Nora stood a little apart, watching them. Sunlight fell across Elias's shoulders, turning the dust on his coat to gold. He looked so sure, so quietly strong, that something inside her, something she'd kept folded tight all her life, began to open. And, before she knew it, before she thought of the stares or the whispers, she walked toward him. The sound of the hammer stopped. A dozen eyes turned, but Nora didn't see them. She reached out and, without hesitation, took Elias's hand. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't planned. It was simple, a truth too deep for words. Elias paused mid-sentence, glancing down at their joined hands. His brow lifted slightly, a flicker of surprise in his eyes, but only for a moment. Then, with a quiet smile, the kind that said everything without needing to speak, he closed his fingers around hers. The warmth of his hand grounded her, steady and real. The forge's fire crackled. The town breathed again, and Nora felt the weight of every watching eye fade away. Elias turned back to the blacksmith, still holding her hand. "She's my wife," he said simply, "and I reckon that's all anyone needs to know." The blacksmith nodded once, a slow smile breaking through the soot. "Reckon that's right. Langdon?" They walked through the rest of the town together like that, hand in hand, past the mercantile, the saloon, the curious faces at the window. For every whisper, there was Elias's calm beside her. For every stare, the steady pulse of his thumb against hers, small, quiet reminders that she no longer had to shrink to fit into a world that once tried to erase her. At the general store, she picked out coffee beans and flour. The shopkeeper, an older man with kind eyes, weighed the goods and cleared his throat. "Good to see you again, Mrs. Langdon," he said, carefully. Nora looked up, caught the faint warmth in his expression, and smiled. "It's good to be seen." Elias paid, tipping his hat politely. They left the store with the morning sun at their backs, the town slowly returning to its noise and rhythm. When they reached the wagon, Elias helped her up again, the way he always did. But before climbing up himself, he paused, his hand resting on the edge of the seat. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. "I know." Then why she looked down at their hands, still lightly dusted with ash from the forge. "Because I was tired of hiding from a life that's already mine." He studied her for a moment, the corner of his mouth lifting. Can't argue with that. Then he climbed in beside her, flicked the reins, and the wagon began to roll. For a while, they didn't speak. The sound of the wheels over the dirt road, the creak of the harness, and the song of distant birds filled the quiet. Then Nora said softly, "You didn't let go." Elias glanced at her, didn't plan to. The road back to the ranch wound through open plains, the grass bending under the wind, the horizon stretching endless and forgiving. Nora leaned back, her gloved hand still resting near his. The sun warmed her face. For the first time in a long while, the future didn't look like something to run from. It looked like a road she could finally walk beside someone on. When they reached the top of the ridge overlooking their land, she turned to him and said, "I think I understand something now." "What's that?" "That love doesn't always sound like a promise." She smiled faintly. "Sometimes it just feels like someone standing beside you, no matter who's watching." Elias looked at her, his eyes soft, his voice low. "Then I reckon you've got it right." That night, as they sat by the fire, the warmth of the day lingered in the air. The wind outside was gentle, carrying the scent of rain and wild sage. Nora watched the flames dance in the hearth and thought about that morning, the way the sun had caught his shoulder, the way her hand had fit so easily into his. It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't bravery. It was belonging. And for the first time, she understood love didn't always need to be said, or proven, or asked for. Sometimes it just needed to be held quietly, faithfully, for all the world to see. But even as warmth returned to the valley, a shadow lingered beyond the ridge, a man riding slow beneath the wide Montana sky, carrying a name she thought she'd buried with the snow. Spring had fully claimed Gallatin Valley when the stranger rode into Jackson Ridge. The grass was high, the air alive with the hum of thawed rivers and distant thunder. But even in that soft season, there are winds that don't belong, winds that carry trouble instead of rain. It was the black horse people noticed first, then the badge, then the eyes. He called himself Deputy Marshal Dean Rourke, the same man whose name had once haunted Nora Vale Langdon's sleep, the man who'd murdered her father under the crossbeam of a burning chapel, years and miles ago. He wore the government's star now, polished bright as redemption, but the look in his eyes told the truth. This was no lawman come for peace. Nora saw him first from the mercantile window. She had come to town for flour and coffee again, the same way she and Elias had done a dozen times since the thaw. The morning had felt ordinary warm light, the smell of leather and rain-soaked dust until he rode past. She froze. Her breath caught halfway to her throat. Time folded in on itself, cruel and familiar. That profile, that scar beneath his left ear, the way he carried himself straight-backed, like a man who'd never once feared the weight of a gun on his hip. Rourke dismounted in front of the sheriff's office, spoke briefly to a deputy, and turned just enough for his gaze to sweep across the street. It found her, and when it did, he smiled, not kindly, not even cruelly, just knowingly, as if to say, "I told you I'd find you, girl." That night, the valley air turned cold again. Elias returned from town later than usual, his face hard, his voice low. "Who is he?" he asked. Nora didn't pretend. She had waited too many years for truth to do her any good. "His name is Dean Rourke," she said quietly. "He was a marshal in Kansas once. My father called him the devil in a badge." Elias said nothing for a long time. The fire cracked between them. Outside, the wind dragged along the eaves like slow footsteps. "Finally," he said, "he's the one who killed your father." Nora nodded, and half a dozen others who stood with him. Then he built himself a new name, under a new post. I thought she swallowed hard. I thought I was free. Elias leaned back in his chair, jaw tight. Freedom's not given. It's guarded. Later that night, when the lamps were low, he found her in the barn. She was sitting beside Ruthie, brushing the mare's mane just to keep her hands busy. The smell of hay and leather wrapped the air in quiet stillness. Elias stepped inside, shutting the door softly behind him. "Tell me everything." And she did. She told him about Kansas, about the night her father's chapel burned, about Jonas Pike's warning, about the years of hiding under false names and borrowed lives. She spoke until her throat felt raw and her heart felt lighter for having no secrets left. When she finished, she expected judgment, or maybe anger. What she found instead was stillness. Elias's face was calm, but his eyes burned steady. He reached down, picked up a piece of straw, rolled it between his fingers, then said simply, "Tomorrow we ride." Nora looked up sharply. "To where north? Over the pass. He won't follow us far if he thinks we're gone." She shook her head. "If we run, he'll find someone else to hurt. someone who stands in his way. Elias studied her for a long moment, the flicker of the lantern catching the faint tremor in her hands, the quiet fire in her voice. "Running's what's kept you alive," he said. "Maybe," she whispered, "but it's not living." He exhaled through his nose, a slow sound that wasn't quite frustration. "Then, finally," he nodded, "then we fight." The next morning broke gray and heavy. The air smelled of iron and rain. Elias cleaned his rifle at the kitchen table, silent but focused. Nora packed provisions, jerky, bread, a canteen. She didn't know what she was preparing for, only that the act of readiness steadied her. When she looked out the window, she saw movement down the ridge, a rider, slow and deliberate, making his way toward their land. Her stomach turned cold. He's coming. Elias rose without a word. He took his hat, slung the rifle over his shoulder, and stepped out onto the porch. Rourke reined in his horse a dozen yards from the gate. He dismounted, boots crunching on the gravel. "Mr. Langdon," he said, voice smooth as oil. "Fine piece of land you've got here." Elias didn't answer. Rourke smiled faintly. "You've got something that belongs to me." Elias's grip tightened on the rifle. "I don't reckon I do." "Oh, but you do," Rourke said, turning his gaze toward the cabin, "a woman who doesn't know how to mind her place." The words dropped like poison between them. Elias's voice stayed low, steady. "You've got 10 seconds to ride off my land." Rourke laughed, not loud, not cruel, just amused. "You think you can scare me? Rancher. You think this badge don't buy me the right to take what I please?" Elias raised the rifle just enough for the barrel to catch the light. "Not here. It don't." For a long moment, no one moved. The wind carried the smell of rain, the faint creak of the saddle leather. Then Rourke's smile faded. His eyes darkened. "You'll regret this." "Maybe," Elias said, "but not today." Rourke mounted again, his horse snorting. "Enjoy your quiet while you can. The law's coming for her, and you'll hang beside her when it does." He turned and rode off, the sound of the hooves echoing against the ridge until it vanished into silence. Inside, Nora stood by the window, her hands trembling. "He won't stop," she whispered. Elias laid the rifle on the table. "No," he said, "but neither will we." She looked at him, really looked, and saw something she hadn't before, not just strength, but a kind of unshakable faith. Faith not in God or law, but in her. He reached out, brushing a stray strand of hair from her cheek. His voice softened. "We'll face him. Nora, on our terms." She nodded slowly, her heart beating steady now. "Then let's make ready." That night, as the rain began to fall, the valley went dark. Lightning flashed over the hills, and thunder rolled deep and slow. But inside the small wooden house, the light from the hearth held steady, and for the first time since Kansas, Nora Vale Langdon didn't feel hunted. She felt chosen not by fate, not by fear, but by her own courage to finally stand where she belonged. By the time the sun rose over the valley, word had already spread. There would be a hearing at Fort Laramie, a reckoning long overdue, and for the first time, Nora didn't tremble at the thought of facing the man who had once taken everything from her. The wind at Fort Laramie carried the cold bite of early winter, a wind that whistled through the cottonwoods and swept across the parade ground like a ghost with unfinished business. Nora Vale. Langdon stepped down from the wagon slowly, her gloved hands trembling only from the cold. The sky was gray and hollow, the kind of color that makes even brave hearts doubt themselves. Beside her, Elias Langdon offered his hand, steady as ever. "You don't have to do this alone," he said quietly. She shook her head, a faint, sad smile on her lips. "I've been running from this day long enough. It's time I stand on my own 2 feet." Elias didn't argue. He only nodded once, the kind of nod that carried a man's respect, not pity. It had taken 2 weeks of hard riding and a letter carried by a Union courier to bring them here. After Dean Rourke's threats, Elias had gone to Sheriff Caldwell, an old cavalry friend who'd once served at Fort Laramie. Caldwell, after hearing the story and seeing the evidence Jonas Pike had left the ledger, the names, the coded routes, had sworn to take it to the military court. Now, the fort buzzed with soldiers, townsfolk, and travelers drawn by the promise of spectacle. A marshal on trial, a woman testifying, justice, rare as rain, about to fall. Inside the courtroom, a converted barracks with walls of rough timber and the faint smell of tobacco, the air was tense and quiet. Dean Rourke sat at the front, his wrists bound in iron. He still wore his badge, pinned proudly to his chest like a mockery. His smile was thin, sharp, and confident, the same one she remembered from Kansas. When he saw her enter, his head tilted slightly. "Well," he said under his breath, "the preacher's girl finally found her voice." Nora met his eyes without flinching. "And you finally ran out of places to hide." Elias stood near the back of the room, his hat in hand. He didn't move or speak, but she could feel his presence like a heartbeat behind her. The presiding officer, Colonel Marin, called the room to order. His voice echoed off the wooden walls. "This hearing is convened to address the charges of murder, corruption, and human trafficking brought against Deputy Marshal Dean Rourke." Rourke leaned back in his chair. "You'll need more than a woman's word to hang a man wearing this badge." Marin's expression didn't change. "We have more than her word. Marshal, we have the ledger, the witness statement from Jonas Pike, taken before his death, and we have her, the only living person who saw what you did in Kansas." The room turned to her. Nora rose. For a moment, her legs trembled, but then she saw Elias standing silent and sure at the edge of the crowd, and something inside her steadied. She stepped forward. Her boots echoed on the wooden floor, each sound louder than the last. When she spoke, her voice was clear, not loud, but certain. "My name is Nora Vale Langdon," she said. "I was born Nora Finch in Dodge City, Kansas. My father was Reverend Samuel Finch." She paused, took a breath. 3 years ago, Marshal Rourke came to our chapel. My father had been preaching against the buying and selling of people freedmen, native children, women. He said it was a sin to profit from the suffering of others. She looked directly at Rourke. "You told him the law belonged to men like you. Then you shot him in the chest. And when I screamed, you set fire to the church." The room went still. Even the wind outside seemed to stop. Rourke's smirk faltered. "He died protecting the people you sold," she continued. "And you've worn that badge ever since, pretending it made you untouchable. But a badge doesn't make a man clean. Truth does." She raised her hand and pointed to him. "That man killed my father. He sold human lives for coin, and he thought a woman wouldn't have the courage to speak his name." Her voice didn't waver. He was wrong. For a long, breathless moment, no one moved. Then Colonel Marin nodded slowly. "That will be entered into record." Rourke shifted, the chains at his wrists rattling. "All lies." He spat, The word of one woman against a marshal's service. You think they'll take her side. A voice came from the back. They'll take mine. Every head turned. Sheriff Caldwell stepped forward, holding a folded letter. Jonas Pike signed this before he died. Names, locations, routes, and your cut. Marshall. Right here in his own hand. He dropped the paper on the table like a stone. Rourke lunged up, shouting curses, but two soldiers held him fast. The chair tipped, the badge clattered to the floor, and just like that. The silence that followed wasn't fear anymore. It was freedom. When it was over, the verdict came swift and final. Guilty on all counts. Sentenced death by hanging at first light. Nora didn't rejoice. She didn't cry. She only stood in the quiet, her heart heavy and light, at once the strange weight of justice finally done. As the soldiers led Rourke away, he turned once, eyes burning. You think this changes anything? You'll still be that scared little girl in the fire. Nora met his gaze for the last time. Maybe, she said softly, but I'm not the one burning anymore. Outside, the cold hit her face like baptism. Elias was waiting, hat in hand, snow gathering on his shoulders. When she reached him, he didn't speak. He just looked at her, as if searching for the girl who had once trembled in the dark. She's gone, Nora said quietly. All that's left is me. He nodded. Then I reckon it's time you stop carrying ghosts. For the first time in years, she felt she could. They walked away from the fort side by side, their footsteps soft in the snow. Behind them, the bell tolled once not for death, but for truth, that night, in the small inn by the Laramie River. Nora sat by the window watching snow fall over the water. She could still hear the echo of her own voice in the courtroom, the sound of it steady, unshaken. Elias sat nearby, mending a tear in his coat. The lamplight caught the lines on his face, turning them gentle. After a while, he looked up. You did good today. She smiled faintly. I didn't do it for me. I know, he said. That's what makes it good. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was peace, at last earned. Outside, the river ran beneath a skin of ice, whispering its own prayer to the night. And somewhere, deep inside her, Nora Vale Langdon knew that the past had finally let go. They left Fort Laramie before dawn, the road stretching quiet beneath a pale sky. But justice, once stirred, is never content to rest, and before they reached home, the land would demand its price in blood. The snow had just begun to fall again when they left Fort Laramie. The dawn light stretched thin and silver over the prairie, turning the world pale and still. The trial was behind them, but Nora Vale Langdon could not yet feel its peace. Justice, she had learned, did not erase the past. It only laid it bare. Elias drove the wagon in silence, his good hand holding the reins steady. The horses moved slow through the drifts, their breath steaming in the cold. Nora watched the fort fade into the distance, a dark shape swallowed by fog and falling snow, and whispered a prayer she hadn't said since childhood. Let it end here, she murmured. Elias glanced over, his breath fogging in the air. It will, he said softly, one way or another. They rode until the sun hung low behind the hills. The wind shifted east, sharp with the scent of pine and rain. Nora leaned against Elias's shoulder, exhaustion pulling at her bones. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to imagine the ranch, the quiet of their cabin, the sound of water over stone, the promise of home. But peace, out here, was a fragile thing. The shot came from the ridge, a crack that split the quiet open. Elias jerked the reins hard, twisting in his seat too late. The bullet found his shoulder, tearing through cloth and flesh. Elias. He slumped sideways, teeth gritted, the reins slipping from his fingers. The horses reared, wild with panic. "Don't scream," he rasped, clutching the wound. "Don't let them hear you." Nora's world narrowed to the blood spilling through his shirt, bright against the snow. She slid from the wagon, dragging him down with her, half lifting, half pulling until they were hidden behind a low rise of rock. The wind howled around them, covering the sound of her sobbing breaths. Elias's face had gone pale, his jaw locked tight. "You have to ride," he said. "Go, before they circle back." "I'm not leaving you," she whispered fiercely. "You don't have a choice, neither do you," she said, pressing her shawl against his wound. "You stay alive. That's all I need from you." The sound of hoofbeats faded. Whoever had fired the shot, one of Rourke's men, maybe, seeking vengeance, had melted back into the wild. Nora looked around desperately. Snow, rock, silence, then movement, a shadow on the ridge, a figure on horseback. Her heart seized. She raised Elias's revolver, hand shaking. The rider slowed, lifted one hand in peace. When he drew near, she saw the feathered braid, the dark eyes, the face she dimly recognized. "Talon," Elias whispered. The man dismounted, crouching beside him. "You remember," he said quietly. His voice carried the calm of a man used to saving others. "You saved me once, near Powder River." Elias managed a faint smile. "Looks like it's your turn." Talon nodded, eyes scanning the wound. "The bullet's clean through. He'll live if we move fast." He turned to Nora. "There's a camp a mile east. My people will help." She hesitated only a heartbeat. "Lead the way." The journey to the camp blurred in motion and fear. The snow deepened, swallowing the wagon wheels. Elias drifted in and out of consciousness, his breath ragged. Nora held him upright in the saddle, whispering words she couldn't even hear herself say. When they reached the camp, a circle of low lodges nestled among pine trees, the women came first, silent and sure. They lifted Elias from the horse, carried him inside. A fire burned hot at the center of the lodge, filling the air with the scent of sage and smoke. Nora knelt beside him as Talon's mother, Ayana, worked with practiced hands. She cleaned the wound, crushed herbs, and pressed them into the torn flesh. Elias groaned once, teeth clenched, then went still. "He'll sleep now," Ayana said softly. "You did well, wife." The word caught in Nora's chest. Wife. It was the first time someone had called her that without question, without pity. She bowed her head, whispering, "Thank you." Days passed. Snow fell steady over the valley, wrapping the camp in white. Nora stayed at Elias's side, feeding him broth, changing the bandage, washing the blood from his skin with water warmed over the fire. Sometimes he stirred and mumbled her name, his voice faint and searching. Once, half awake, he said, "You shouldn't have stayed." She brushed his hair back and smiled. That's what wives do. "Elias." He didn't answer, but the corner of his mouth lifted, just barely. One night, when the wind outside was low and the fire burned down to embers, she took his razor and a small basin of water. His beard had grown wild during the days of fever. Carefully, she lathered and shaved him slow, steady, the way he once sharpened his knives in the barn. The sound of the blade was soft, almost like breathing. When she finished, She sat back, studying him, the scar along his temple, the faint creases near his eyes. He looked peaceful, younger somehow. She spoke quietly, as if confessing to the dark. "I used to think love was a thing you had to earn," she said, "something that could be taken away when you failed to be good enough." She touched his hand gently. "But now I think maybe love is what's left when you stop running." Outside, the snow stopped falling. The night held its breath. By morning, Elias woke fully. His voice was rough but strong. "You've been busy," he murmured, seeing the clean shave. "I didn't want you meeting the angels looking like a mountain man." She teased softly. He chuckled, a weak sound, but alive. "Guess I disappointed them then." She laughed, and the sound broke something open in her, all the fear, all the grief, dissolving into warmth. Ayanna entered, smiling. "He will walk again soon. The land has spared him." Nora looked at her husband. Yes, husband, and felt the truth settle deep in her chest. The land hadn't just spared him, it had given them both back their lives. That evening, as the sun sank behind the mountains, Talon stood beside Elias outside the lodge. The air smelled of pine and thawing snow. "You owe me a horse," Talon said, grinning. Elias laughed softly. "I'll send two." When Talon turned to leave, he paused beside Nora. "He's strong because you didn't run." He said, "Not many would stay." Nora met his eyes. "I spent too long being afraid. It's time I learn what it means to stay." He nodded once, then rode off into the darkening pines, the sound of hooves fading into memory. That night, beneath a clear, cold sky, Nora lay beside Elias in the quiet of the lodge. His breathing was even, his hand warm in hers. For the first time, she didn't feel like a guest in his life or a shadow in her own. She felt rooted, like the land itself had claimed her at last. By the time the snow melted and the rivers began to sing again, Elias could walk without pain, and Nora had learned what home truly meant, not a place, but the person you choose to stay beside when the world turns cold. When the thaw came, it came all at once. The snow melted into rivers that ran bright and hungry through the valley, carving new paths where ice had ruled for months. The air changed softer now, filled with the scent of pine and wet earth. The first blades of green pushed through the brown, like promises kept. Nora Vale. Langdon watched the world come alive again from the doorway of the lodge. The camp that had been her refuge through the long winter was stirring children running between lodges, smoke curling thin from cooking fires, the sound of laughter carried by the wind. Behind her, Elias Langdon gripped the wooden cane Talon had carved for him and took another careful step. His movements were slow, uneven, but steady. "That's it," she said, smiling. "The ground's solid, trust it." He grinned faintly. "I do. It's my legs I don't trust." She laughed, the sound light and unguarded, and something in him eased. For months, she attended to him dressing his wounds, lifting him from the bed, teaching him to move again. But it wasn't just his body that had been mended in that time. It was the silence between them. Two once filled with ghosts, now warmed by something that didn't need to be spoken. By early April, the river had shed its ice, and the sky stretched wide and blue above the valley. Nora began planting again herbs, onions, and a small patch of wildflowers near the lodge. She liked the way life insisted on returning, even to a land that had seen so much loss. Talon came often to visit, bringing venison and fresh hides. He said little, but always left with a nod to Elias. Two men who understood that gratitude didn't need many words. "You'll stay?" he asked one morning, glancing at the fields beyond the ridge. Elias looked at Nora before answering. "No," he said softly. "This land saved us, but it's not ours to keep." Talon nodded. "Then where will you go?" Elias looked toward the northern hills, where the mountains met the sky. Somewhere the water's clear and the land's quiet. "Montana, maybe." Talon smiled. "That's good country, strong country. It's time to build something that's ours," Nora said. When they left Snow Ridge Valley, the camp gathered to see them off. Ayanna embraced Nora, pressing a small leather pouch into her hands. Inside was a braid of dried sweetgrass and a smooth stone the color of the river. "For protection," Ayanna said, "and for memory. Both are needed in a new life." Nora's eyes stung. "Thank you for everything." Ayanna smiled gently. "You came to us with fear. You leave with light. That is enough." Elias shook Talon's hand, their grips firm and wordless. Then, together, husband and wife rode north. The mountains rose higher each day, their peaks still tipped with snow. The road wound through forests and meadows, across streams that sang with spring melt. They didn't speak much, they didn't need to. The sound of hooves and the wind through the trees said what words could not. They were free. Weeks later, they founded a small piece of land near the foothills of Montana, where a creek wound clear and cold between tall pines. The soil was rich, the grass deep. Elias dismounted first, looking over the land with a quiet awe. "It'll do," he said simply. Nora laughed, climbing down beside him. "You said that about me once." He smiled, eyes soft. "Best thing I ever said." They bought the land with the money Elias had saved from the army years ago, a modest sum. But enough. There were no deeds to sign, no priest to bless it, no law to bind them but their word. Out here, that was all that mattered. They built the cabin together. Elias cut the timber, his shoulders still stiff but growing stronger. Nora carried the smaller pieces, drove nails, mixed mud and straw for the chinks between the logs. At night, they slept under the stars, the half-built frame above them open to the sky. Some nights, wolves howled in the distance. Others, the world was so still she could hear the river breathing. "Do you ever miss the life we had before?" she asked once, staring at the fire. Elias poked at the embers. "The pain or the peace, both," she said. He thought for a moment. "I think one taught us how to earn the other." She smiled, watching the flames catch in his eyes. "You always know what to say." He chuckled low. "Not always, just when you're looking at me like that." By late spring, the cabin stood finished, small but strong, with a stone hearth and a porch that faced the river. Nora planted a garden out back, rows of beans and corn and wildflowers to keep her company. They didn't have much, but they had enough on Sundays. Elias would walk down to the creek with his cane, the sunlight catching on his hair, silvering it at the edges. Sometimes she'd follow, carrying coffee in a tin cup. They'd sit on the rocks, their boots touching, the sound of water between them. She never forgot what it had taken to reach that moment, the fear, the loss, the blood. But out here, those memories began to soften. They became part of the soil, part of the story that now belonged only to them. One evening, when the sky burned gold behind the hills, Nora stood by the door of the cabin, her hands still dirty from the garden. Elias came up behind her, resting his good arm around her waist. "You see that," he said, nodding toward the sunset. "That's ours now." She leaned back into him. All of it. He smiled. All that we can see, and all that we can keep in our hearts. She turned to face him. That's more than I ever dreamed of. He kissed her forehead. Dreams are small things. This is living. As the light faded, the first stars appeared bright and steady against the vast blue of the Montana sky. For the first time, Nora didn't feel like someone who had survived. She felt like someone who had arrived. No church bells marked their union. No papers bore their names. But under that sky, beside that river, they were husband and wife in every way that mattered, bound not by vows or witnesses, but by every breath they'd fought to share. And when the wind moved through the grass, carrying the scent of spring and earth, it sounded almost like a blessing. That summer, the world felt endless. But when autumn came and the nights grew long again, Nora found herself lying beside Elias under the silver moon, realizing that love, real love, isn't learned. It's remembered. By the time summer turned to autumn, the valley had settled into a rhythm that felt almost like breathing. Days began with the call of meadowlarks and ended with the steady hum of crickets. The river ran clear again, its song softer now, as though it too had learned rest. For Nora Vale Langdon, the months had passed in quiet labor tending the garden, mending clothes, baking bread in the small stone hearth she and Elias had built together. Life had become a circle of small, gentle things. Sometimes, when she hung the laundry out to dry, she would stop and look at the sky so wide, so blue it hurt, and realize she no longer feared the silence. The land wasn't empty anymore. It was home. Elias Langdon's shoulder had healed by then. The scar still ran white against his skin, but he carried it easily, like a reminder that even pain can become a part of living, once it's been forgiven. He walked without the cane now, though he still kept it by the door, out of habit more than need. In the evenings, when the work was done and the air smelled of pine and rain, they would sit together on the porch. He would sand down old wood for new furniture, and she would read aloud from the one book she'd kept from her father's chapel, its spine worn, its pages yellowed but beloved. Neither of them spoke much anymore. Words, they'd learned, were only half of understanding. The rest lived in the quiet, in the brush of a hand, the sound of a shared breath, the weight of someone's presence beside you when the world grew dark. One night, the moon rose full over the hills, a silver coin in a velvet sky. The light spilled across the fields, soft and forgiving. Nora couldn't sleep. She stepped outside barefoot, the cool grass bending under her feet. The air was crisp, clean, carrying the faint scent of wild sage from the ridge. She walked past the garden, past the half-finished fence Elias had promised to finish tomorrow, until she reached the clearing by the creek. The water caught the moonlight and scattered it in 1,000 bright pieces. She lay down on the cool earth, staring up at the stars. Somewhere behind her, she heard the door creak open, then close again. Elias's footsteps were slow, measured. "Can't sleep?" he asked. She smiled without looking up. "Too much peace, maybe." He chuckled softly and sat down beside her. "That's a fine problem to have." They lay there for a while, not speaking, not needing to. The wind whispered through the grass, the river murmured nearby, and above them the sky stretched wide and wordless. After a long silence, Nora said quietly, "I think I understand now." Elias turned his head toward her. "Understand what?" "What it means to be a wife," she said. Her voice was soft, but steady. "It isn't about knowing what to do, or what to say. It's about being still beside someone, even when the world isn't. For a moment, she thought he might laugh the way he used to when she tried to explain feelings too big for words. But instead, he reached over and took her hand. "You don't have to understand it," he said. "You just have to live it." She looked at him, the moonlight silvering his face, catching the small lines near his eyes. "I think I am." He smiled that quiet, crooked smile she had come to love. "Then you're doing just fine." They lay there, hand in hand, watching the clouds drift across the moon. Nora could feel his heart beat through his palms, slow, steady, grounding. She thought of all the nights she had been afraid, all the years she had wandered without a name that felt like her own. And then she thought of this one, this quiet, holy night, and how, for the first time, she didn't need to ask who she was anymore. She belonged, not because the law said so, or because a church had blessed it, but because love, real love, had made its own place for her. Elias turned toward her, brushing his thumb over the ring she wore, the simple gold band, dull from years of wear. "Still wearing that old thing," he murmured. She laughed softly. "It's seen as much as we have." He studied it, the faint moonlight glinting off its surface. "It's not new. It's not perfect." "No," she said, her voice a whisper. "But it's true." He nodded slowly. "That's what matters." And then he kissed her a quiet, unhurried kiss, full of everything they had lived through and everything they didn't need to say. Later, as the night deepened, they lay side by side again. The moonlight caught the edge of the ring on her finger, reflecting a soft silver glow that shimmered like a promise. Nora turned her head slightly, watching Elias's eyes drift closed. His breath evened, his hand still warm in hers. She smiled faintly, whispering into the cool night. "We made it. Elias." He didn't answer, didn't need to. The wind stirred, carrying her words into the dark, across the river, over the sleeping land that had seen them through so much. And somewhere, between the rustle of the trees and the whisper of the water, she thought she heard her father's voice again, calm, proud, and at peace. The dawn came soft and blue, the first light spilling through the pines. When Elias woke, Nora was still there beside him, her head resting against his shoulder. He looked down at her, at the way the light caught her hair, and thought not for the first time that some things were too sacred for words. "Morning," he said quietly. She smiled without opening her eyes. Already he chuckled. "Afraid so. Then we should start the day." He looked out at the rising sun, at the land they had built together, and shook his head. "No rush," he said. "Let's just stay a little longer." And so they did, two souls once broken, lying together under a sky that had forgiven them both. The silver moon faded, the light of a new day rose, and the world for a little while was perfect. In the end, it wasn't the battles they fought or the miles they crossed that defined them, but the quiet, steadfast way they loved each other when the world had nothing left to give. Under the silver moon, love wasn't learned or earned. It was simply found, out here on the frontier. Love was never about grand gestures or easy roads. It was about choosing to stay when fear said run, when silence felt safer than truth. In Nora and Elias's story, we saw two broken souls find something stronger than survival belonging. They taught us that love doesn't begin with certainty. It begins with a trembling step toward someone who meets your fear with gentleness, not demand. It's built in the quiet into shared work, in forgiveness, in showing up day after day, even when the world feels cold. We may not live on the open plains anymore, but the lesson still holds sometimes. The bravest thing we can do is simply stay. Stay when life hurts. Stay when words fail. Stay long enough to see that tenderness can grow even from loss. Because in the end, love isn't something we learn how to do. It's something we allow ourselves to feel imperfect, unpolished, but real. So, if this story touched your heart, thank you for sharing this quiet moment with us. If you believe the world could use a little more gentleness, a little more grace, please take a second to like, share, and subscribe to Frontier Hearts. Together, let's keep telling stories that remind us no matter how rough the road or wide the land, the human heart is still the bravest place of all.